We are going to be talking about intergenerational impacts of colonization in Indigenous societies for grade 9 social studies. My name is Megan Hurst-Kraft. I got Kelsey May here, and I have Alexi. So we're going to start off with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge we are on Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Cree and Métis peoples. We pay respect to the First Nations and Métis ancestors of this place and reaffirm relationships with one another. We recognize that in the course of studies, we may spend time teaching and learning Indigenous territories and Métis homelands. We wish one another safe, productive, and respectful encounters in these places. So we're in learning environments. So students will have a diverse set of prior knowledge. They will have a very flexible learning space, and our unit plan is set to accommodate different skills and abilities that will be showcased throughout the lesson activities. And a lot of our activities are student-centered. We're going to be honoring each student's voice throughout the learning. So our broad areas and cross-curricular competencies. So our first one is building lifelong learners. So students will build basic skills by researching and investigating historical and social events for their assessments and to share with other students. Scaffolded to students throughout the units, they will critically analyze different sources of information to help develop their worldview. They will be lifelong learners by learning how to research and find things out for themselves. This can be specifically in a social studies context or cross-curricular. Learning about a variety of current events within Canada. Building a sense of self of community is our second one. So students will understand and relate to others by researching a historic figure to act as the historic context around it, and how these events affect people in the present. Students will develop self-concept by acting as the historic figure, building their confidence in public speaking and transmitting ideas orally. Students will explore the local community when exploring the schoolyard and area to visualize the history of the community. Moreover, students will engage in a variety of exit slips in different forms to help students reflect on their sense of self and make goals for the future. Our third one is building engaged citizens. So students will understand and relate to others by seeing how historic events affect many citizens in Canada today. Students will build positive lifestyles by looking at how they can help change and recognize past biases they may have had and figure out how to address those. Students will show membership in society by recognizing how some people are treated differently, have intergenerational trauma, and what they can do to be an ally and help change this. As these skills are scaffolded for the students, they will gain skills to become advocates for their beliefs in and outside of school. So our cross-curricular competencies. So developing thinking. Students will need to think critically when assessing the usefulness of the resources they will read and use for their interview. Students will have to think creatively when planning their interview, taking into account accents, dress, mannerism, and empathy to portray their character well. Students will have to think contextually when participating in classroom activities and for smaller assignments, which will cover a variety of mediums and skills. When planning the lessons, students will engage with different thinking styles, simultaneously and independently. Developing identity and interdependence. Students will understand and value human diversity and right by learning about the issues facing Indigenous peoples in Canada in the past and the present, how things have changed, and the work that still needs to be done. Students will understand and value themselves by engaging in solo and group projects, testing and developing their critical thinking and creativity skills. Throughout the unit, students will reflect in their identity in the lesson discussion on cultural appropriation. Students will reflect upon the elements of their identity. So developing literacies. Students will develop knowledge of various literacies by having to analyze and find different pieces of media and interpret them, as well as create their own. Students will understand and communicate meaning and learning through different mediums such as an interview, written activities, and visual activities. At the beginning of the unit, students will analyze different sources of information, which further develop oral, written, and technological literacies. These literacies are integrated throughout students' inquiry. As they are researching, students will have the opportunity to explore different literacies. And the last one is developing social responsibility. Students will contribute to the well-being of self and others by investigating the struggles of Indigenous people in history and present and what they can do to be allies. Students will use moral reasoning when researching their interviews, so they act out their characters and answer questions in character and properly. Throughout the unit, social responsibility is integrated within the lesson plans. Students will acknowledge how societies have progressed and recognize the role they have in deconstructing inequalities within Canada. So we have quite a few for our broad areas and cross-curriculars. So here are learning outcomes. So DR 9.1, DR 9.2, DR 9.3, and DR 9.4. So examine the challenges involved in obtaining information about societies of the past, synthesize the significance of key historical events into societies to study, assess the relationship of natural environment in the development of a society, and determine the influence of societies of the past on contemporary life in Canada. And all of our indicators are how we guided our endured understandings. Okay, so enduring understandings. So it's focused on the historical events in Canadian history and how it has intergenerational impacts on Indigenous societies. So students will understand how different societies within Canada have changed over time, what impacts past societies have on the present and future. They will understand the differences between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation, and they will understand the consequences of cultural appropriation. So our essential questions are, why is it important to analyze historical events and the impacts of colonialism? What is the significance of key historical events in Canada? What are the intergenerational impacts of colonialism on Indigenous peoples? In what ways can our community work towards reconciliation? And the skills are really important. So they will be analyzing pictures of historical events, describing historical events. They're going to create a timeline of historical events, which Kelsey will touch base on later. They'll critically analyze the intergenerational impacts of colonialism on Indigenous peoples. They will explain the impacts of colonization and territorial expansion in the environment. They will inquire and communicate thoughts about key historical events and historical figures in Canadian history. They will examine their role in challenging oppression and racism against Indigenous peoples. They will collaborate with their classmates. They will act out historical figures in Canadian history. They will research Canadian history. They will explore different resources and historical artifacts for accuracy, reliability, and purpose. They will teach the class about Canadian history, and they will interview their classmates on their key historical figure. All right, Lexi, this is you.
Great. With prior knowledge, we have a couple things that students will be developing in our unit. So first off, they'll be analyzing the advantages and disadvantages of oral accounts as sources of information about historical events, investigate the role of literature, visual art, music, newspapers, photographs, and other artifacts in obtaining information about the past, recognizing the dynamic nature of historical knowledge by identifying examples of changes occurring in the interpretation of history as a result of new information uncovered or acknowledged, represents in a timeline the key historic events in society studies, relate the origins and the repercussions of an event in history to society studied, judge the importance of an event in history of society studied, the people in the society, connect the characteristics of natural environment with the settlement and movement of people, explain the effect of the natural environment in the progress or decline of societies, analyze the effects of colonization, territorial expansion, and empire building on the natural environment, and analyze the impact of knowledge acquired from historical events on a fully contemporary society. And so next up, we have the performance task. So what we have figured out for this is a interview with a historical figure. So the students will be taking on the role of a historical figure in the timeline that we are giving for them in the unit, and they'll act this out in front of the class and in front of the teacher as the teacher asks them questions about their character that they picked. So for the first section, we have G, understand the significance of historical events. So students will have to research and look at events related to this figure, what their role was, and what the outcome was from their actions. R, the roles. The students will be taking on the role of a historical figure, and this will be done for an interview. They'll have to opportunity to dress as the person and act and act out their role. Students will have the opportunity to ask questions to the figure as well as the teacher as well. A is the audience. So the audience for this is the teacher, the classmates, and any other potential staff in the room. Of course, for some differentiation, which you'll see later, some students could opt into just doing it solo with the teacher as well, if they're sort of like not comfortable with that. As well, S, the situation. Throughout the unit, there will be achievable challenges that the students will face. These challenges are set out to scaffold students in the performance task, and the students will be presented with the challenges of remembering the significance of their historical figure and the role it played in Canadian history. We have P, the product. So the student will be interviewing their classmates and acting out roles of key historical figures in Canadian history. This will take place in one class period with time prior for students to research the historical figure. And finally, S, the standards of the criteria of success. And we've decided this will be made cooperatively with students and the teachers, so to allow students to take more leadership in their learning. So other than the performance task, we do have some other evidence that we are going to be assessing the students on. So some of it's summative and some of it's also formative. Some of the summative assessments include a timeline of historic events, which students will create based on the aligned society. As mentioned, it will provide a checklist will be used to assess the timeline. They'll be making a Venn diagram for their natural environment lesson, as well as they'll be graded on their research notes for historical accuracy, for content, and for relevance. Some formative assessments include informal observations, which will occur throughout the unit. This will be things like checking in on students' work, observing them while they're working and while they're doing research. Informal conversations are built into lesson planning. During independent or group work time, the teacher will float around the room and conferring with students. This can all be done in a group setting by asking all the students at once, so everyone gets the same benefit. Exit slips through some lessons. Also Mentimeter, word maps, and polls to gauge whether students are where they are at academically and personally, as well as ongoing feedback from all the other previous assessments to help students know where they're at in the unit and what work they'll have to put forward. As well, we do have some self-assessment. And through this planning process, students will be given the opportunity to engage in self-reflection and assessment. Students will reflect on the understanding of Canadian history throughout the completion of the self-assessment rubric. Furthermore, they will hand in a self-assessment at the end of the performance task. Throughout the unit, there have been exit slips that have been included in some of the for the students to reflect on their learning thus far and where they have to go. For the historical event timeline, students will be given a checklist that will be handed in to help them reflect on the current state of their assignment. Students can refer to the checklist throughout the process. Furthermore, throughout the unit, reflective moments have been included to give students the opportunity to self-reflect and assess where they are. This will take form of exit slips or Mentimeter, and this formative assessment will include reflective questions for students to interact with. Yep, and I think that's everything we have for assessments.
Okay, so for our summary about the learning plan, when we were creating our lessons, we really started at the performance task and worked our way backwards. And the reason that we chose to do this is we wanted to highlight that each skills that the students would need to be successful in the performance task would be scaffolded towards them. Another focus that we had was on inquiry. We focused highly on the 80-20 rule, where the teacher would be more of a resource and a guide for students throughout the unit and allow students to get ownership over their own learning and participate in a learning environment that could really cater to their interests and their strengths. This unit is Indigenous infused with content, perspective, and knowledge. This was really important to us that we included place-based learning, Indigenous resources, and an elder coming into the room. Those are just a couple things that we have done to infuse Indigenous content within the unit and really provide students with a holistic approach to their unit and Canadian societies. So throughout the unit, we're starting off by critiquing and analyzing different sources of information. And then it kind of starts where they create a timeline off of a specific society. Next, it becomes more specific where they look at the environment of that society, key historical figures, and so forth. So we really created it where it starts off fairly broad and it narrows it down into the performance task. So I always find that the adaptive element within a unit is very important because no matter where you walk into a classroom, there's always going to be a diverse set of needs. So we created our adaptive element fairly broad for the focus that you can take this unit and adapt it to any different classroom that you walk into. So some of the things that we are doing for struggling students is ongoing feedback through formative assessment and working kind of one-on-one, taking things step by step so they don't become overwhelmed and they can focus on one task, move on to the next, and so forth. So there will be changes in the working environment so they feel comfortable and safe and feel like their voices are welcome, as well as adaptations to the performance tasks. And so it could be one-on-one instead of with the whole class as mentioned. To challenge students, they can assist peers. We can widen the expectations for the performance task. We can lengthen assignment expectations. And sometimes it's really important to have that ongoing feedback to really push their work to the next level. So for analysis and reflection of this unit, as I kind of touched on before, is we started with the performance task and we worked our way up. And the way that we chose to do this is we kind of came up with a plan, saw what outcomes would best suit our unit, and then we looked at the indicators. And the indicators really formed our lesson and how we were going to scaffold those skills necessary to complete the performance task. As I slightly touched on before as well, that we really wanted to focus on students having a voice and honoring different perspectives throughout the unit. And we really tried to do that by doing more of an inquiry self-directed study. So one thing that we did is we tried to incorporate a variety of different resources so students can best showcase their learning and they can acknowledge all like and interact with all of the different aspects that make a society. So that's kind of a rundown of our unit. Hopefully you enjoyed it and I'm excited to hear your feedback.
Thank you for having us. Okay, how do I stop recording? Okay.